Welcome to Your Next Bold Move. Our show is all about helping you take your next step, whether it's career or relationships or life in general. Hi, and welcome to Your Next Bold Move. My name is Wendy Kaplan. Today's show is focused on entrepreneurial thought and action, and our guest is Charlie Kiefer. Charlie is president of Innovation Associates and co-author of the new book published by the Harvard Business Review, Just Start. So why don't we start off by your telling us a little bit about your background and how you got into this work on entrepreneurship to begin with.
I graduated from college. I went to work for one of my professors, and after a couple of years, they fired me. And so I found a company or two that wanted to hire me as a consultant. And one thing led to another, and we created a very successful little company that in 1995 I sold. And then the company I sold it to went bankrupt. And then when the company went bankrupt, I bought my little firm back, and a couple of years later, I ran into Len Schlesinger, who was then at that point just becoming president of Babson College. Len was immersing himself in the study of entrepreneurship and ran across this book by Sarah Sarasvathy of the University of Virginia and said, "Charlie, you got to read this." And I realized that this was the first book that really reflected how I thought about things. And for the first time, my thinking process was clear to me. And I just got very excited about it. And Len said, well, we need to really go into this. And we were at it about a year. And then Len said, well, why don't we write a book about it?
Oh, and people can get this on Amazon. And the book is especially great for people who are either in an entrepreneurial venture, in business for themselves, want to be in business for themselves, because it walks them through the process.
We started coming out of entrepreneurs and realized that the logic that these successful serial entrepreneurs use, that Sarasvathy identified in her research, was applicable anywhere in life that you're faced with high levels of uncertainty. And the message is so simple, you think you have to plan a lot, you need to know a lot, all that kind of, and so no, if you really look at an effective stance to take in the face of unknowability or high levels of uncertainty, is just start.
In an unknowable, uncertain world, which we live in now, the point is to take a step and take a look around and then see how it worked out.
Essentially, the more unknowable, the more you have to act your way into the future, and the less sense it makes to think your way into it. So if you look at Sarasvathy's research, she started with thousands of successful entrepreneurs and finally boiled it down to a sample of 30 that she then went out and interviewed extensively. And these are people that had started major businesses of $250 million to $6 billion. Most of what I had read was all about how entrepreneurs behaved and whether they were, whether everybody says, well, they're visionary and, they're very creative and they're able to discern the future and they're highly self-confident. And the big one, of course, is that they just have a high appetite for risk. Well, it turns out under the microscope of actually looking that most of those things aren't true. That, first of all, entrepreneurs as a class of people are relatively risk averse, at least compared to bankers. Bankers are more risky than entrepreneurs.
That's wild.
Now, entrepreneurs are very clever at reducing the risk to as close to zero as possible. And if in the elegance of what we've termed acceptable loss, which is one of the elements of these entrepreneurial thinking, is that each step you take has got to be in something that you would be willing just to lose. Now, what that does is psychologically drop your risk to zero.
Right.
And practically, it reduces it enormously as well. So these entrepreneurs go through life and they don't think of themselves as terribly risky because in their view, and it certainly was in mine, it wasn't. So what Sarasvathy did, she studied how they thought. And she came up with some stuff that was remarkably consistent across her sample of 30 people and stood in marked contrast with how, say, middle managers and everybody else thought about life. So the first element is it's born of desire. So you start with desire, and it really makes no sense to go into the unknown unless you want to. Everybody thinks that entrepreneurs have to have enormous amounts of passion, but most of them, or many of them, didn't when they started. They just had a vague notion of where they wanted to go.
So it's okay if you're not like over the top excited.
I think this myth about that you have to be passionate at the outset, I think it's number one, it's false. And number two, it causes an enormous amount of people to edit themselves out of entrepreneurial activity.
I think that's so true.
And the second, maybe the second element, or the first that Sarasvathy identified, is you want to act quickly with the means at hand, with the emphasis here at means at hand. When you're in the unknown, you don't know what's going to be useful. You know what you've got in front of you.
Right.
You're going to figure out what can you do, what step can you take in favor of your desire based on what you've got right now.
Right.
Second big principle was the notion of acceptable loss. So you may have a lot of money, but you might not want to spend it.
Right.
It's an and. You got to have
Right.
what you want or what you're capable of, and the second is what you want.
Yeah.
And the currency is rather unusual. Most of us think about money and time as the major elements of entrepreneurial activity, but the third one is reputational
I was
capital.
thinking about that, right.
You know, and your family, you know, the relationship with your family.
Right.
And then what's the cost of doing this? Because it means you can't do something else.
Right.
So all of these things go into the calculation of acceptable loss. And the wonderful thing about acceptable loss is that it takes a whole host of unknowns and renders them known, because you know how much money you have,
Right.
you know how much time you have, you know how much of your reputation you want to put on the line,
Right.
you know all of those things. The third thing is you're going to bring other people along. These entrepreneurs are just great at sweeping lots of people up. A good chunk of people bring tangible resources and
Right.
money and all that kind of stuff, but they're also really good at a phenomenon we call enrollment, which is how you get other people excited about what you're
Right.
doing. And the elegance of enrollment is that if I can get you excited about something, the likelihood of you telling somebody else about it is very high.
Right.
And then the fourth we've already talked about, which is you build off what you find.
Right.
Now, if I go back to the predictable universe, if you encounter something that you didn't plan for, you were an idiot. You should have figured that out.
Right.
You should have been able to foresee that. Big mistake, you better go fix that. In the unpredictable universe is where these serial entrepreneurs play. Wow, what can I do with that? I mean, I may now know something nobody else in the world knows. What can I do with it? I could build it into my product. So they befriend reality. They're converting all the time. They're converting obstacles and
Right.
problems into assets.
That's great.
And the next step can be one of two things. It can be another step in favor of what I wanted,
Right.
or sometimes, because I've now accumulated
Learn
some
some
new
things.
resources,
Right.
And I've got but sometimes I have a new opportunity in front of me.
Right.
And I'm looking at that and I say, geez, that's more fun. I think that would be a little cooler. And so they pivot and they go off in a different direction. If there's
Right.
something you want and you're in the unknown, then applying predictive logic that permeates our educations and our organizations doesn't make logical sense. It leads you to the wrong conclusions and it could be ultimately dangerous, right?
Right.
So in those situations, you want to use this sort of act, learn, build kind of idea. Now, as you act, learn, and build, you're going to learn more, and the more you learn, the more you're going to be able to bring prediction in. So this is not, oh, I'm just going to throw thinking to the winds. This is, I'm going to act my way into the future, and I'm going to create evidence as I go along, and the evidence that I create is going to be fodder for my analytics, if you will.
Right.
The metaphor is to become bilingual.
Right. So two kinds of reasoning: predictive, planning, planful, and how you act through the unknown.
Right, and you're going to be just like if you were going to, and you knew Spanish, and you were going to a cocktail party, and you walked up to somebody who, who spoke Spanish. You just shift from English to Spanish, and then we'd turn to the next
Right.
person. You'd go back to
A
English.
toolbox
Right.
where you pull out when you need it.
Right, but they really are different. If you look at predictive logic, you start with an endpoint, you go to where it is, off you go, and you stay right on track. But there's really a different contrast in what we'll call act, learn, build, and that looks like the second animation. And you can see how different these look just by putting them side by side.
Yes.
Right? But what the real difference is what happens in each of these logics when you encounter an impenetrable obstacle.
It's
You make your way around it.
Right, just deciding what to do.
We said most of the obstacles we face in life is because of our thinking.
I know, we do this to ourselves. I
Right,
mean, this
and
is
we
true
don't
in
see a
life.
way around it, right?
Right.
But anybody on the outside could look at this and
Right.
see something that we don't see.
That's right. Well,
Right.
because we're in the middle of it,
You're
so
in
it's
the middle
harder
of it,
to
yeah,
see.
yeah.
I'm so glad that you were here, and I'm so delighted that, first of all, I love this book, Just Start, and I've read it, and I'm giving it to clients, and I highly recommend it, and I'm so glad that you were here, and I so appreciate your time and coming.
Thanks, Wendy.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for watching today. And in addition to the resources and ideas shared with us by our guests, you can also go online to our other community for some free support and inspiration at themagicparties.com. A big thank you to our guest, Charlie Kiefer. Thanks to all of you, our listeners. You are meant to go forth in the world to use your gifts and talents.